On a wind-cut mountain in New York, the man who helped save the Union sat under blankets with a pencil in his hand and death in his throat. Ulysses S. Grant could barely swallow. Each word cost him pain. Each page was a race against time. Yet in those last days at Mount McGregor, the general who had broken the Confederacy wrote something even heavier than war. His final truth there about Abraham Lincoln himself. Stay with me for a few minutes, because this story begins in war, but it ends inside a sick room alone. In June 1885, Grant was carried to a cottage at Mount McGregor, already dying of throat cancer and trying to finish the memoirs that might save his family after his financial ruin. He wrote in a chair wrapped against the cold and finished only days before he died on July 23rd. What he left behind was more than a soldier's memory. It was a verdict on the president he had watched more closely than most men ever could. In 1861, the country Lincoln inherited was already breaking apart. 7 slave states had left the Union before he was even sworn in. On April 12th, Confederate guns opened fire on Fort Sumter, and the crisis turned into open war. Lincoln entered the White House with half the nation doubting him. He looked awkward, sounded plain, and moved with a patience many mistook for weakness. That first wound ran deeper than politics. The Union was fighting for its survival, and the man at the center of it did not look like the kind of leader people expected in a storm. Grant did not look like an answer either. He had resigned from the Army in 1854. He farmed in Missouri, fell into hard years, and by 1860 was back in Galena, Illinois, working in his father's leather goods store. His life had narrowed. He was quiet, broke, and easy to overlook. When war came, that changed almost at once. He drilled volunteers, returned to service, and rose because he did something many generals around him did not do. He moved. He accepted risk. He understood that this war would be won by pressure, not by waiting for a perfect plan. Early victories gave him shape. Fort Henry fell in February 1862. 10 days later at Fort Donelson, Grant forced the surrender of about 12,000 Confederates and became a national name. Newspapers turned his initials into a nickname tied to unconditional surrender, and the North, desperate for action, grabbed onto him fast. Then came Shiloh in April. The battle stunned the country. Grant's army was hit hard, the ground was soaked with blood, and critics wanted him removed. Lincoln refused. He kept Grant in place because Grant still fought forward when others froze, and that choice began to bind the two men long before they were truly close. The rise did not stop there. In 1863, Grant took Vicksburg after a long campaign and a siege that ended on July 4th, splitting the Confederacy along the Mississippi River. Later that year, he was sent west again and helped break the Confederate grip around Chattanooga. Those victories changed his place in the war. He was no longer a useful field commander from the western rivers. He was becoming the one general Lincoln could trust to keep going when every other road seemed blocked. Still, the cracks were there, and people saw them. Grant carried the old stories about drink. He was blunt, awkward, and not built for polished rooms or careful politics. He was also willing to spend lives in battle if he believed the result could end the war sooner. Lincoln had cracks of his own in the public mind. He listened too long, pardoned too often, and carried a sadness that made some men mistake depth for softness. Remember what made him dangerous to his enemies. He looked harmless. That was the trap. Behind the patience was iron. Grant started to see it before many others did. Lincoln did not hover over him or choke him with orders. He wanted action, and once he found a man who would act, he gave him room. In March 1864, Lincoln made Grant lieutenant general and put him over all Union armies, a rank no American had held since George Washington. It was a huge gamble because the war was still eating men by the thousands, and the North was tired of promises. Grant came east to face Robert E. Lee in Virginia. From that moment on, their fates locked together. If Grant failed, Lincoln might fall with him. If Lincoln wavered, Grant's campaign could collapse under politics before Lee ever broke it in the field. They were very different men on the surface, but each had learned how to absorb doubt without showing panic. Each had also learned that the war would only end when the Confederacy was forced everywhere to feel constant pressure. Then came the hardest stretch yet, the wilderness, Spotsylvania, Cold Harbor. Grant kept moving south, pinning Lee in place, refusing the old pattern where one bloody battle ended in retreat and delay. The cost was terrible. Families read casualty lists and wondered whether this new partnership would save the Union or drain it white before victory arrived. Newspapers called Grant a butcher. Lincoln's enemies waited for failure. Even some friends feared that the president's trust in this hard, silent general might destroy them both. But Lincoln did not pull back. He stood with Grant, took the political fire, and held the center while the country shook. That told Grant something he would never forget. Lincoln's calm was not weakness. His kindness was not fear. His patience was not drifting. Yet by the time that truth was becoming clear, the war was moving toward its last and most dangerous turn. By March 1865, the war was finally bending toward an end, yet the closer victory came, the more fragile everything felt. Petersburg was tightening around Lee's army, Richmond was failing, and Lincoln came down to City Point to stand near the front while the last moves were being made. That visit said a lot about him. He was not hiding in Washington and waiting for others to finish the job. He wanted to see the closing stage himself, and more than that, he wanted to shape what came after. Around Grant's headquarters and aboard the River Queen, Lincoln met with Grant, Sherman, and Admiral David Porter. The guns were still speaking, but Lincoln's mind was already beyond the surrender. He wanted the fighting stopped and the country put back together without turning peace into revenge. Grant heard that clearly. He had spent 4 years watching blood decide almost everything, and now he was hearing the president think about mercy while the smoke was still in the air. Days later, after Lee broke out of Petersburg and tried to escape west, Grant stayed on him without pause. The chase was hard, muddy, hungry work. Confederate lines were collapsing, roads were jammed, and men on both sides knew the war was nearly over. On April 9, 1865, at Appomattox Courthouse, Lee surrendered. Grant arrived with a headache, wearing a mud-spattered private's blouse instead of a grand uniform, and gave terms that were firm but generous. Confederate officers could keep their sidearms, enlisted men could go home. When it came up that many of Lee's men needed their horses for spring planting, Grant let them keep those too. That decision was not some soft moment after a hard war. It carried Lincoln's spirit all through it. End the war, yes, but do not poison the peace on the first day. For a brief moment, it looked like that spirit might hold. Washington erupted in celebration. Church bells rang. Crowds filled the streets. The Capitol, worn down by years of loss, was finally breathing again. Lincoln looked lighter. The strain never left his face completely, but people around him noticed a change. He was talking about restoration, about the states coming back, about moving forward without feeding the country to endless punishment. That was the turning point. The Union had won the war, and Lincoln was preparing to guide the peace. Then came the night that shattered the shape of everything. On April 14th, Lincoln invited Grant and Julia Grant to join him at Ford's Theater. They did not go. Grant had already arranged to leave Washington and visit his children in New Jersey. While traveling, he learned the news that hit like a second war had just opened. Lincoln had been shot. At almost the same time, Secretary of State William Seward was attacked in his bed. Rumors spread fast through the dark. For hours, people did not know how many leaders had been marked to die. Lincoln survived through the night only in the most painful sense. He died the next morning, April 15, 1865. Grant came back to a city that no longer sounded like victory. The cheering was gone. Fear had replaced it. Grief was everywhere, and beneath the grief was something colder. The man who had stayed steady through 4 years of national collapse had been cut down just as he stood at the edge of peace. Grant felt the blow in a deeply personal way. He had almost been in that theater. He had almost shared that box. He had almost been part of the murder scene itself. Instead, he returned to watch Lincoln laid out in the White House East Room and joined the mourning of a country that suddenly understood, too late, how much had rested inside one man. This is where the cost became harder to measure than the war itself. The armies were beaten, the rebellion was dying, yet the one leader who seemed able to carry victory into reconciliation was gone. Andrew Johnson took Lincoln's place, and the center of gravity began to shift almost at once. Anger sharpened, suspicion deepened. Old hatreds which had briefly seemed containable started finding new life inside the peace. Grant could already feel the change, even before the full damage showed itself. He had seen Lincoln up close, had watched him bear pressure without losing his balance, and had seen how much strength could sit inside a calm voice and an open hand. Now that hand was gone, and the country was left with triumph on paper and uncertainty everywhere else. The war had ended at Appomattox, but something larger had been wounded after the surrender, and Grant would carry that knowledge for the rest of his life, long before he finally found the words to write it down. Years passed, and the country learned a hard lesson victory alone could not teach. The guns had gone quiet, yet the peace came in angry, uneven, and stained from the start. Andrew Johnson clashed with Congress. Former Confederates pushed back. Black Americans, who had every reason to expect a new life after slavery, met laws, intimidation, and violence instead. People still spoke of Appomattox as if surrender had closed the wound, though the deeper damage kept spreading under a different name. Grant watched all of it. He served in the government, became president, and spent years trying to hold together a nation that had ended one war without ending the hatred beneath it. By the time old age reached him, the public memory had already started smoothing the edges. Lincoln became a martyr in black cloth and candlelight. Grant became the silent general who finished the fight. That version was clean, simple, and incomplete. The truth hurt more. In 1884, Grant lost nearly everything in the collapse of Ferdinand Ward's firm. Soon after came the cancer that made eating painful and speaking harder by the week. He was dying, broke, and racing to finish the memoirs that could leave money for Julia and his family. That is when the final truth came into focus. He no longer had use for performance, and a man that close to death had little reason to flatter anyone. When he wrote about Lincoln, he wrote with the blunt clarity of someone stripping away a national misunderstanding. He made it plain that Lincoln's kindness had never been weakness. His patience had never meant confusion. His calm had never meant fear. Grant had seen too much pressure, too many fragile men, too many loud men pretending to be strong, and he knew the difference. What Lincoln carried was rarer. He could be humane without surrendering authority. He could choose mercy without losing control. Grant also faced the part history still struggles with. Lincoln's murder did more than shock the country. In Grant's own judgment, it drove Reconstruction back and made the peace harsher, more bitter, and less wise than it might have been. That was the admission buried inside his final pages. He had beaten Lee in the field, yet he believed the nation lost something at Ford's Theater that no army could recover. People often think strength looks hardest when it shouts, punishes, and breaks what stands against it. Grant's last lesson cut the other way. Real strength can look quiet. It can sound patient. It can leave room for mercy even after terrible bloodshed. By the end, the dying general was no longer writing only about war. He was writing about what power becomes when it forgets restraint, and what a country loses when its strongest soul is mistaken for a soft one. Grant finished the book, laid down the pencil, and a few days later, he was gone. What remained was his final measure of Lincoln. The Union was saved by force, but its best chance at healing died in a theater.